Well, let me tell you, first of all, what an honor it is to be speaking in a room full of people so curious, so effectively curious. I've checked out your website, Knowledge is Power, right? Some of you know that already. And you guys knock it out of the park. It's as if you passed an audition you didn't know you were taking. So it's an honor to be here, trust me. The President of the United States and the Secretary of State are walking down Pennsylvania Avenue. The Secretary of State, William Seward, points to a shop and reads the sign over the door, T.R. Strong. Quick as a whip, the President, Abraham Lincoln, counters by saying, well, maybe, but coffee are stronger. It's a sleeper, okay? It's a sleeper. The chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Charles Sumner, strolls into the White House. He's the president polishing a pair of boots. And he says, Mr. President, you polish your own boots? And Abraham Lincoln looks up from his task and with a twinkle in his eye that would light up this room says, well, whose boots did you think I polished? Brain candy, isn't it? It's wit. Examples of wit. And wit, almost by definition, comes and goes on butterfly wings. Isn't that right? But I don't know that there's any relationship between wit and wisdom, other than the fact that both words begin with a W. You probably heard the story of Winston Churchill and Mary Astor. She was the first woman ever elected to Parliament in London. She was a prototype for the women's liberation movement. He was an old-style male chauvinist pig. And the following exchange took place on the floor of the House of Commons. Sir, if you were my husband, I'd put arsenic in your tea. Madam, if you were my wife, I'd drink it. That always gets a laugh. But I don't know that there's anybody in this room who would want to build a lifetime's worth of relationships with the opposite sex based on the wisdom of that exchange. But with Lincoln, we've got a distinct difference. I think it's because the way this man is wired. We take standard issue, God-given talent. I don't believe this man was massively talented. That's a cop-out. We add to that a profound and abiding concern for his fellow man. Once again, any of us can do that. Most of us are concerned. We add to that, into the mix, personal problems that would choke a horse. I don't know that there's anybody in this room, myself included, that can match Lincoln's experience of being on the business end of a suicide watch. August 1835, probably January 1841, surely. And even when he wasn't suicidal, he suffered from chronic clinical depression. Now, there are probably some psychotherapists in this room. If you had spent 5 minutes with this man, you'd conclude chronic clinical depression. An endless stream of frontier tragedy as a child. We throw into the mix some problems that should have finished democracy on this planet. And when all the dust is settled, we have nosebleed accomplishments beyond the power of words to circumscribe. So, when this man is funny, not necessarily witty, not necessarily the brain candy, when he's funny, be on the lookout for the wisdom. Because unlike the Churchill example, this is wisdom you could build your life on. This is Rock of Gibraltar, solid wisdom. Even the small examples. Now, I'm going to give you a little tiny slice of a very full life. The Lincoln-Douglas campaign of 1858 for the United States Senate. I've chosen that because, well, that campaign has a beginning and a middle and an end, and when we get to the end, we'll have some Q&A, and I'll say something funny, and we're out of here. Okay, that's the structure for today's talk, such as it is. So, when I'm finished with that story, there'll be time for some Q&A, and probably maybe a half hour or so, because I want to know what you think. Stephen A. Douglas was coming up for re-election. 1858 to the United States Senate. He was the sitting senator for Illinois, the head of the Democratic Party in the Senate, and the go-to man in Washington. If you wanted to meet anybody or get anything done, you went to Douglas. During the campaign, he traveled in regal splendor in a railroad car provided for him by the president of the Illinois Central Railroad. Lincoln traveled on that same railroad, but coach. They held a series of 7 debates, as I'm sure you've heard of, up and down the state of Illinois. And I would imagine people coming to those debates behave pretty much like you and I would behave. You know, you get there a little early and be milling around chatting to your friends. And, well, the time to start would come. Time to start would pass. Well, you couldn't have that continue. Whatever about these people here in the crowd, them fellas up there on the platform, they're important people. Things to do, people to see, places to go. But you couldn't have some clown get up and blurt out, "Okay, everybody, want you to settle down and shut up because we're ready to start now." Because that's not funny. Well, Lincoln had a better idea. He just told a joke. Mostly, when he told a joke or a story, it was very pointed. But in this occasion, I would think he didn't care about the topic, but that it was a long one, maybe 3 or 4 minutes. And my guess is people there did what you and I would do in a situation like that. Hey, quiet down. Hey, he's telling a joke. I want to hear the joke. Because Abe Lincoln had a reputation as being a storyteller. We don't necessarily know that today, but when you list out all the world-class American wits on one hand, Ben Franklin, Mark Twain, Will Rogers, or whoever you want to name that you know, Abraham Lincoln is going to take up most of the fingers. So, as the joke wore on, more and more people would say that. So think of a pebble dropped into a still pond, right? This concentric circle of silence extending outward from the platform. And eventually, of course, Lincoln would get to the punchline, everybody laughed. Well, not everybody. Them fellas way out there in the fringe of the crowd, they weren't laughing. They didn't hear the joke. And my guess is they'd probably say what you and I would say in a situation like that. Hey, we got to quiet down and pay attention, because he just told a joke and he's bound to get off 3 or 4 more before this debate's over, and I don't want to miss but the one. And in the process, Lincoln achieved what everybody there knew needed to be achieved, which was to get everybody to quiet down, pay attention. And it is as good an example as any you're ever likely to experience of the difference between management and leadership. And everybody in this room myself included, we've all been on the receiving end of management. You get this report done by Tuesday at 9 o'clock or you're fired. Now that's going to get your attention. But I submit to you, it will not sustain your attention on Tuesday at 10 o'clock. Isn't that right? Say yes. Yes. Say yes like you mean it.
Yes.
Yeah, better believe it. Lincoln doesn't command attention. That's not his style. He entices cooperation. He entices cooperation. Now, this talk is not about my experience, 13 years teaching in a California state prison, but I'm sure you can imagine what life is like for convicted felons, because they're not enticed to do anything. They're told what to do, and they're not told politely. Trust me on that. So when Lincoln, I more or less stumbled into it, when Lincoln came into their life because it looked like maybe they needed him, they reacted, well, like a potted plant shunted mindlessly into a basement and then exposed to a little moisture and sunlight that does something like this. That's an action replay. Fast forward, action replay. I would read excerpts from what came to be my book. I hadn't written it at the time yet, but I would read today's excerpt from this book and just leave it and get on with the rest of the day's work. And the next day I'd do the same thing, usually in the morning. The best compliment I ever got on that book was from a convicted felon. Mr. Wilson told me once, Kunst, I really like coming to school on Monday because you give us Saturdays and Sundays. I really like getting Lincoln. The enticed, even after being in the grave 150 odd years. Small example. Deep wisdom. Told a joke. Got the cooperation. By the way, Stephen Douglas didn't tell the joke. I don't know whether he had a sense of humor or not, but it looked to me like he didn't have the imagination to make that leap. Here, I could do something about this. Want to get this thing started on time? I'll tell the joke. I don't think Douglas would even have thought of that. You know politicians like Douglas. Senator, I'll even name him for you. Senator Phineas T. Windbag. You know him. Phineas T. Windbag. You know him. He comes out of the Senate building and he looks down the steps at the end of the day and he sees a TV news crew down there in the corner. And he makes a beeline for that news crew. Oh, he really wants to be on the 6 o'clock news, even if it's for only 45 seconds. You know him. There's no such thing as bad publicity. You know him. I know that's really important to him. So do you. I don't know that your ultimate welfare or mine is nearly as important. Wisdom. In a tiny example. Big wisdom, small example. During the course of one of the debates, Douglas accused Lincoln, Mr. Lincoln, you're two-faced. Now, you got to know something about this fellow. You've all seen this picture. I chose it for the cover of my book. And you're probably thinking, he's not rugged handsome. He's rugged handsome. That's what you're thinking. That's because you know the end of the story. But if you subtract the end of the story and you look at that face, what do you got? You got the sunken cheeks, right? He's got the big mole in the face and the hooked banana nose. This guy looks like a 19th century male prototype for the Wicked Witch of the West. Now, isn't that right? Say yes. Go ahead and laugh. You're not insulting the man. He knew that about himself. In fact, he used to say, if I ever find a man uglier than myself, I'll shoot the wretch, put him out of his misery. And he loved to tell this story about himself. He was working out in the woods in Illinois as a young man. A woman came up to him and said, "Sir, you are the ugliest man I have ever met." And he said, "Well, ma'am, I don't reckon there's much I can do about that." And she said, "Well, you could stay home." So when Douglas accused him of being two-faced, this is what Lincoln did. Turned to his audience and said, "Well, I leave it to you, my friends, to decide if I had a face different to the one you see in front of you. Don't you think I'd be wearing it?" Now, history does not record what Douglas said immediately after the laughter died down, but I can imagine it went something along these lines. Well, anyway, right? There probably are some politicians in the room here, maybe retired politicians, and a whole lot more who would like to be a politician. And you know that part of the definition of being a politician is you get the last word. And that will be true, unless, of course, you're in the presence of a more astute politician. Isn't that right? By the way, I don't know about you, but there have been times in my life when people called me a name. Mr. Lincoln, you're two-faced, called me a name. And there's only one thing I'd want to do in a situation like that, and that's to lay the guy out. Just punch that guy right into next Tuesday. Now, I didn't learn that in the prison system, it just got reinforced when I got there. And if somebody had stopped me at that point and said, "Now, Arnold, here's what you need to do. You just got called a name. What you need to do is somehow bring humor into the situation and diffuse the power of that attack." And I'd probably say, "Well, yeah, that's very good advice." But I'd say the same thing to you if you told me I need to clean my garage. It's just not going to happen. By the way, that's not what Lincoln did. But did he get his revenge? Say yes. Yes. Say yes like you mean it.
Yes.
By the way, did he, in that first example where he told the joke before the debate started, did he just win the debate a little tiny bit before it even started? Say yes. Because a debate's like a boxing match, isn't it? Not only is there no place to hide, but you score or are scored against a little bit at a time. There are very few knockout punches. On another occasion, he came out with the mother of all debate singers. Now, we just had an election back there in November, and I don't know which way you folks voted. whether you were for Obama or Romney. And I don't mean to disparage your candidate, but I can tell you this. Back there about a year ago, July, August, September, coming into those debates, both them fellas were looking to score and win over that elusive and maybe non-existent person known as the undecided voter. I don't know whether any of you ever met that creature, whether that person even existed, but they were after it, okay, both of them. And they were like little boys, both of them, with noses pressed against the candy store window, looking for that mother of all debate zingers, that supreme gotcha moment that will win over that undecided voter. I got it right here. There is no debate zinger to top this one. During the course of one of those debates, Douglas came out with some line of reasoning or other, and rather than deal with the argument, he just dismissed it. Didn't attack the person, dismissed the argument, and this is what he said. Hasn't it got down about as thin as a homeopathic soup made by boiling the shadow of a pigeon that died of starvation? And of course, people laughed then, and when the laughter was over, Douglas is left with which, by the way, is the verbal equivalent of a sidestepping pregnant duck. Well, now we come to the end of the campaign, and I got good news for you and bad news. The good news is, according to the vast majority of historians, Lincoln won the bulk of those debates. The bad news is Douglas went back to the Senate. Even though, according to the calculations of at least one historian, and they're kind of convoluted, Lincoln won by 4,000 votes. I say convoluted because at the time, you didn't have what you would expect, a place on the ballot that said Stephen A. Douglas and a box for an X, and Abraham Lincoln and a box for an X, if you put an X on one of the boxes. That's not the way it was done. Because the election to the Senate, up until the early 20th century constitutional amendment, was indirect. And the equivalent of the Electoral College for the president was the state legislature, the Senate. Douglas got more delegates, because you voted for delegates, just like you do for the presidency. You voted for delegates, and since the South of Illinois was weighted heavier than the North and the slavery issue and on into the night, Douglas squeaked in. He should not have squeaked in. He should have galloped in. He should have trounced this guy. Who was the national figure here? Not Lincoln. Lincoln was a podunk lawyer. He was an effective trial attorney. Had a way of winning over 12 men, good and true, and jurors and judges. He was good at that, but at telling stories. That sounds like nothing, doesn't it? Not when you're up against one of the biggest names in the United States Senate. He shouldn't have been anything like as effective as he was against Douglas. You see, you should be astounded by that. There are all kinds of dimensions of this man that are just astounding. Think of this. For the previous 17 years before his election to the presidency, Abraham Lincoln was a partner in a two-man law firm in Springfield, Illinois. Now, if in the 1840s and 50s, if you went any further west of Springfield, Illinois, if you went any further west, you'd fall right off. Podunk, USA. And he moves into the presidency in 1861 without missing a beat. There's a constitutional crisis of the first order, and he doesn't know where the bathrooms in the White House are. They're going to fire on Fort Sumter, a federal installation, and he's going to lose it because he can't save it. What's he going to do? He's just given his oath of office, and he pulled it off. Of course, he lost the fort, but wow, he did a job on Jeff Davis, because he turned the tables. Astounding. You'll be astounded right, left, and center in looking at this man. By the way, to get back to this election, to the Senate, that's where Lincoln saw his destiny as a United States Senator. His experience had been, such as it was in government, as a legislator. He was a very good writer, had a knack for putting things clearly and simply. My politics are short and sweet like the old ladies dance, right? Old ladies don't waste movements when they dance, okay? Short and sweet. That's where his power was. That's where his strength was. He never thought about the presidency. Presidency at that time didn't add up to a row of pins. Who ever heard of, I don't know, Millard Fillmore or John Tyler, or any of these guys? That was not where it was. If you wanted power and prestige, it was the United States Senate. It was Daniel Webster. It was John C. Calhoun. It was Henry Clay, his great boyhood ideal. Not the presidency. And he had gone after it twice now. 1855, I didn't have time to tell you about it. He lost. 1858 was a big one, and he lost. And I could imagine Lincoln looking out over his psychological landscape at that point in his life and seeing nothing but ashes and rubble and blood. It's a great way to end a talk on wit and wisdom, because for a politician to lose an election, that's about as funny as a broken leg, isn't it? By the way, is there something I'm supposed to read out of that book? We're not done with this example, are we? Is there something I'm supposed to read out of that book? Yes. Say yes. Yes. Is there something I'm supposed to read out of that book? He was asked for his reaction to that defeat. This is what he said. I felt like the boy who stubbed his toe rather badly. Hurt too much to laugh. He's too big to cry. Lincoln was supremely ambitious. His law partner of 17 years once said, "Ambition is a little engine inside him that knew no rest." He really wanted to be a United States Senator. He really wanted to be a United States Senator. It was gone. But that quote tells me something about the character of the man. That you can be ambitious, lose the object of your ambition, and your elbow will not fall off. Remarkable. Who would have thought? His elbow didn't fall off. It's not true of all politicians, is it? There's some politicians who are so dependent on being a politician, a senator, a representative, a governor, that they'll pay any price. They'll do anything to win. They'll cheat. Would they cheat? Would they ever cheat? They'd never cheat, would they? No, never, never, never would they. Would the votes come in alphabetical order? No, that would never happen. Would they appoint people around them because of their own psychological insecurities that would choke a horse? Would they appoint people around them that say the things the boss wants to hear, even though that may not be to your ultimate advantage or mine as the electorate? Politics can be a dirty business. I'm not telling you anything out of class. I'm preaching to the choir here. Well, he's ready for whatever's going to happen next. Among other things, one of the things that's very remarkable and astounding about this man is his utter pliability. You can't pin him down with a mistake, because he's going to recognize that mistake before you do and change without being the chameleon, without, the man has no principles. That wasn't the case. He just adjusted. He made mistakes. He just didn't own them the way perhaps you and I do. Well, I'm going to stop here, and if we have Gordon and Virginia could do the microphone thing, and we'll throw this open to some Q&A, and then at the end, I'll tell you something funny, and we're out of here, okay? So, anybody got any questions?
Yep.
Cool, got a question up here?
Yes.
We'll wait for the microphone.
Why was he called Honest Abe? Behind that?
What do you mean behind that?
Well, I'm sure that all his dealings as a lawyer, knowing lawyers, he could not be totally honest. So I just wondered if indeed, I just wondered what was the reason he was called Honest Abe?
A nice, short, simple question. At age 23, when he ran for political office for the first time, ran for the Illinois State Legislature, he lost in 1832. 2 years later, he won. But that year that he lost, a exit poll indicated that in the little village where he lived, New Salem, Illinois, he received 277 votes from the 300 voters in that village. Translation: to know Lincoln is to trust Lincoln, is to vote for Lincoln. There's so many quotes I can refer to. If you would win a man over, first convince him that you are his sincere friend. You cannot convince him you are his sincere friend and pull a fast one. You can't be dishonest and pull a fast one, because sooner or later they'll spot it. He really was honest. The idea of him, chasing down the road for however many miles because somebody didn't get enough change and he's got 3 cents that he has to give the lady or whatever, when he was a storekeeper. Whether that story's true or not, it probably is, but I wouldn't get carried away with it. But he really was honest. He really did believe in that. It's the reason why he's so pliable, because facts aren't set in concrete. They aren't for you. They aren't for me. Things change. The guy's wife gets pregnant, you get transferred to Schenectady, things change. And you must be adaptable. And if you're dishonest, one of the prices you pay is you're inflexible. There's a kind of inflexibility built into it. And he is so pliant. He is so pliant. He never stays put where you placed him. So if you ask a question about, in one of the Lincoln Douglas debates, he says this about slavery, because I don't want a woman for a slave doesn't mean I want her for a wife. All these kind of evasive things that changed. His visions, his opinion of religion was this kind of like agnostic person as a young person, just didn't know, just plagued with all these frontier tragedies in his life that I didn't go into, but as he experienced just this massive devastation from the Civil War, really, there's some kind of a God. I mean, he was pliant. I don't know what your views are of God, but if they haven't changed over your lifetime, maybe there's something wrong with you. I'm just saying, okay? His did. By the way, I forgot to do this. Would you, let me pass these out. Sign up for my Lincoln blog. I've got a Lincoln blog. And, but make sure you can just pass that around. Make sure you can, I can read it, because if I write one thing down wrong on your email address, and it goes to the Chinese takeaway, they're not going to understand. So make sure I can read it, okay? Any other questions?
Questions? Yes, over here.
Thank you.
What influence did his wife, not her problems, but her intelligence, have on Lincoln?
Well, at the very beginning, he was smitten by her. He had a way of being this country bumpkin, because he looks like a country bumpkin, doesn't he? Just 6'4", and arms and legs that went on forever, elbows and kneecaps in all kinds of a which direction, and he's got a stovepipe hat on. I mean, give me a break. The guy doesn't know how to dress himself. What's he doing? About 7 feet up there. What's he doing? It's like a 6'9" woman wearing heels. Well, oh, give me a break. But when he met her, he was smitten. As one historian said, she could make a bishop forget his prayers. She was witty, she was well-read, urbane, cultured, all the things he wasn't. Why, yes, Mr. Lincoln, I'm a fiery little Whig myself. I even know Henry Clay. You know Henry Clay? Why, yes, he's been a visitor at my father's house. She grew up like this in Lexington. And, of course, he was very conscious of the fact that he was nobody. had no social standing whatsoever. He was, by the way, the only Lincoln at their wedding. What does that tell you? This man was not perfect. Didn't he invite his family? Didn't he have any family? Answer, he did. And no, he didn't invite them because he was ashamed of them. But she wasn't dismissive of him. She admired him for who he was, not dismissed him for what he looked like. And she saw a man who was clearly ambitious. He would make something of himself. And she was ambitious too. But for all her political acumen, Victorian age, no way. Is she going to run for office? I don't think so. She was his first political advisor. And probably fiercest supporter. She did have some personal problems, but she was the first supporter. And that role tended to taper off once they reached the pinnacle of ambition, the end job the man had, which was President of the United States. That role tapered off almost to nothing because he just didn't have the time. The war was soaking up so much of his time and attention at that point that he had almost no time at all for it. But that's not the way it started. Any other questions?
Do you think he had a magnetic personality?
Did he have a magnetic personality? He could be very self-deprecating. I've already indicated that. He used to like to tell the joke about him and Jeff Davis. This one Quaker woman says, "I think Jefferson will succeed." And the other woman says, "Why does he think so?" "Because Jefferson is a praying man." "But so was Abraham a praying man." "Yes, but the Lord will think Abraham's joking." Because he was always joking, okay? That isn't to say that he should be dismissed, because he had great force of personality, just enormous when called upon. And it wasn't always called upon. I got one story for you that just nails it. It's told by Carl Sandburg in his biography, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. City Point, Virginia, February 1865. A war that cost some 750,000 lives is nearly over. The president is touring the front, and in the course of that tour, he happens on a tent filled with Confederate sick and wounded. The ranking officer conducting the tour stops him and says, "Mr. President, you can't go in that tent. It's full of Rebs." And if Abraham Lincoln were like 99% of the people he led, whether field commander or private, businessman, child, mother, sister, daughter, this is what he would have said. "Well, thanks for the warning. I certainly don't want to waste my time on that rabble. They're the ones responsible for all this death and destruction." And unless he were a woman or a child, would invariably have added, "God damn them all to hell!" And that's not what he said. What he said was, "That's the very place I need to go." And he stepped inside. And inside that tent, among all those sick and wounded, was one Henry L. Benbow, a colonel in the 23rd South Carolina Artillery. Colonel Benbow takes up the story. I was lying on my back with my hands folded across my breast when the president approached me and extended his hand toward me. "Sir," I said, "do you realize who it is to whom you offer your hand?" "I do not," he said. "Well, you offer your hand to a Confederate colonel who has fought you as hard as he could for 4 long years." "Well, I hope a Confederate colonel will not refuse me his hand." "No, sir, I will not." And I clasped his hand in both of mine. Wow. That story is remarkable from another number of points of view. I can imagine a presidential visit making its way through the grapevine, even to a tent filled with Confederate sick and wounded. I can further imagine somebody like Colonel Benbow with his mindset having a straight-edge razor under his blanket on the 1,000,000 to 1 chance that he gets close enough to Abraham Lincoln to strike a blow for the Confederacy. One more, both legs shot off, but I can do one more. You think John Wilkes Booth was the only one that hated this man that much? What do you think accounts for the change in a man that has fought for 4 long years? And that's just the fighting. Were there some years before that when there was hatred of everything Northern, including anybody like Lincoln? Of course. And the twinkling of an eye, I clasped his hand in both of mine. What accounts for that? What is the one thing that's going to change all that but magnetism? Isn't that right? Just this tremendous force of his personality. What is there that accounts for the change I saw in my convicted felon students when he's been dead too long to make any change again? There's something about this man. It's as if his death released something about his psychic DNA that just has tremendous power, as it did over Henry L. Benbow. Tremendous power. By the way, what does it say of you and me? Don't we have the capacity for that kind of power? Because in that little recitation I gave you at the very beginning of, God-given talent, we've got God-given talent. Concern for fellow man, we're concerned about our fellow man. All that stuff. Personal problems, you got personal problems. You're all screwed up, you're too much here, you're not enough there, you're just like me. Shoelace breaks and there's no time. That happens to everybody. He had personal problems, you got personal problems. He achieved tremendous things in his world. We don't live in that world. We can achieve tremendous things in the world we do live in, just as he did in the world he lived in. Any other questions? Yes, in the back.
I was just curious. He's very busy. I don't know if he kept a personal diary, but do we know anything about his spiritual practice? What it was like growing up, and then has it changed over time? Did he use transcendental meditation or anything like that?
a wonderful question. I've never been asked that. I've been asked the one about the honesty. You're not the first there, but I've never been asked that one. And I've given this talk probably 130 times or so. But I've never been asked that. My best friend is the man who provides me a book I've never read before. And when he'd get a book, which were rare commodities in the 1830s and 40s, as you can imagine, way out there on the edge of civilization, he would read it and read it and read it and read it and read it. There's this lovely quote, by the way, of reading Parson Weems' biography of George Washington, and how his capacity to, just the depths that he went to when he was reading. That he's reading the accounts of these battles in the Revolutionary War, and even though I was a boy at the time, it was something that they were struggling for beyond just national independence. There was something that extended beyond their time and their issue. Something that applied to all people for all time. Something about freedom and the end of divine right of kings and all that. His capacity to read even as a boy at that depth. So to answer your question, I don't think there are any documented evidence that he, did the meditation thing. Although, if you misquoted scripture, it'd tell you what the quote was and where you will find it. In the Psalms, in the Gospels, wherever. And he knew his Shakespeare inside and out. He had a photographic memory, just like he had a photographic memory for jokes. Something would happen, and that reminds me of a story. Drove Stanton nuts. I don't know whether you saw the movie or not, but Stanton the movie, that was accurate. You're always going on with these jokes, and he walks out of the room. He can't stand another one of these. Well, that reminds me of a story things. He was a man of great emotional self-discipline. It's evident in the joke I told about your two-faced thing, that he doesn't react the way most people would. Knock the guy into next Tuesday. Well, you think I'm two-faced, well, what about you? And then go on to attack him. That's not what he did. Great emotional discipline. I don't know where he got it. My guess is it came from his angel mother. And then after she died, from his stepmother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, then Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln. He was blessed in two women who had a way of saying to him at a very young age, Abe, you can do anything you set your mind to do. Can't you just see this little boy at his mother's knee? Now, they didn't say that because they knew, my Abe, he's going to free the slaves and win a civil war, so whatever else I do, I have to inspire him with unassailable self-confidence. That's absurd, isn't it? That's not what they did. Weren't that way with everybody? Say yes. Yes. They were that way with everybody, including their son. They didn't know, those quietly remarkable women, that he was going to free the slaves and win a civil war. Just like you and I, we have no way of knowing what the things we say to affirm the people in our world, how those things are going to impact the world down the corridor of years. We have no way of knowing. Any other questions? Yes, we got a question up here.
Did he at any point have an opportunity to input who his vice president was?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Because
The vice president, yeah, go ahead.
his vice president was probably the worst possible person to handle the next part of our country.
Well, that's, he's the first one ever to be impeached, of course. He had all kinds of power over that choice, because the vice presidency, even according to Gardner, who's one of FDR's vice presidents, the vice presidency isn't worth a bucket of warm, and then he said something else that I don't want to repeat in this room. And it wasn't worth more than a bucket of that warm substance. It's only very recently that vice presidents have any real importance, and even then, well, you want to send, your second in command off to do the, chopping and changing because you're above all that. He chose Johnson because Johnson was a Democrat. That was important to him because we want to unite the country. He's a Republican. And because he was a Union man from Tennessee. So in 1864, it was a very wise choice. Did Johnson have some personal problems? Sure. At the inauguration in 1865, March 4th, we all know about Lincoln's second inaugural. We don't know about his inaugural, Johnson's. When Johnson gave his inaugural, he was a little drunk, because he was really proud of himself. And Lincoln said, "Don't let that man say anything else." So there was a couple of problems there. On the day Lincoln was shot, the story goes that Johnson said, "They shall suffer for this. They shall suffer for this," pacing back and forth in his room on April 14th, 1865, while Lincoln lay dying in the Peterson house. Any other questions? We're wrapping up. I will finish with my little party piece joke. I can imagine Abraham Lincoln standing right here. But he doesn't look like this. You see, he looked like this when he's sitting in front of one of them photography people. Now, you know them photography people now, because all they do now to get your picture, they just do that. It's over. Well, what would happen back there 150 years ago? You get your picture took, and you do this. What's going to happen to the picture? It's going to blur out. Why is that? Because you got to have lots of time for the exposure. We want plenty of exposure time. And that's the reason why he looks kind of strange there. Now, you don't think he looks strange because you're used to the picture. But I can tell you, the Abraham Lincoln standing right here, he don't look like that. He's got that twinkle in his eye I was telling you about earlier. And he leans over and he whispers the following in my ear. This is what he says. "Now, Arnold, you've been working this crowd pretty good on that wisdom stuff. That's all well and good, but they're leaving now, so send them out with a bit more of that brain candy. Tell them about the postal inspector." Well, if you were standing here where I'm standing, and Abraham Lincoln told you to tell him about the postal inspector, isn't this what you'd do? "Well, I certainly will, Mr. President." Isn't that what you'd say? Yes. Say yes like you mean it. Yes. Well, then I'll tell you about the postal inspector. This fellow was pestered from one end of his presidency to the other while fellas looking for jobs. Now, you guys are long in the tooth. You know that politics is all about jobs for the boys. Now, isn't that right? Yes. Mr. Lincoln, you never would have won Cobb's County if it weren't for me. I want to be a U.S. Marshal. That kind of thing. Think Princess Diana and them fellas on the motorcycles with the cameras, okay? So this fella comes up out of the blue, and he says to Mr. Lincoln, Mr. President, Postal Inspector just died. Could I take his place? Lincoln thought for a minute and said, well, it's all right with me if it's all right with the Undertaker. You've been a great audience. Thank you very much.
Wonderful presentation. And we'll see you here next week for the World Bank. Thank you for joining us.